Hi everyone, I'm Michelle. Welcome back to my channel. In the previous video, we have covered linear regression with one variable, which is the simplest form of linear regression. Toward the end, we introduced the concept of cost function g of theta. Today, we are going to dive deeper into a parameter learning algorithm, which is called gradient descent. This is an incredibly important algorithm that's widely used in many computations related to machine learning algorithms. Specifically, we will explore how to apply gradient descent to minimize the cost function g of theta in linear regression. First, let's start by understanding what a gradient descent is and what problem it aims to solve. In general, we have a function g of theta, like the one from the last video for linear regression. It depends on two parameters, g of theta 0 and theta 1. So what do we want to achieve with this algorithm? From our previous discussion, we know that the better the model, the closer its prediction are to the actual values. In other words, a good model will minimize the differences, and therefore the cost function value will become smaller. So to achieve this, we need to adjust the parameter values to minimize the cost function. Now, how do we go about it? Here is the process. We could start by selecting an initial pair of values for theta 0 and theta 1. After that, we could iteratively update these values in a way that consistently reduces the cost function, and then we will repeat this process until we find a minimum value. So the example we have just discussed so far is just a simple case. In reality, gradient descent is a general concept that can be applied to various machine learning algorithms. Often, we're not just working with two parameters, but like several or even hundreds. For simplicity, we will stick with two parameters in our explanation. First, we will use visual aids to build an intuitive understanding, and then we will dive into the math. Now let's take a look at the 3D plot on the right-hand side of this slide. If you have watched our previous videos, you should be somewhat familiar with this graph. It represents the cost function as a surface with theta 0 and theta 1 as axes. Each point on the surface corresponds to a specific cost function value. In simple cases, the surface might look like a bowl shape. Here, we are choosing a more complex example to illustrate what happens. Imagine you're looking at this from a bird's eye view. Our goal is to navigate this surface to find the lowest point. What should we do, and what results could we get from here? Here is how gradient descent works in the visualization. We will start by choosing a starting point. This is like picking an initial position on the surface we marked by an X here. Based on the position of the spot, we will need to find the steepest downhill direction. Thinking of the surface as a hilly region. Some areas slope downward and others slope upward. Our task is to locate the direction that leads downhill fastest. In other words, once we have an initial point, we will look around, find the quickest path to lowest position, and then take a step. In the next direction, we will repeat what we did just now and take a step to move in that direction. In the following iterations, we will keep calculating the best direction at each step until we reach to a point that all directions slope up forward. This means we have found a local minimum. Now, what happens if we start from a different point? Even if the new starting point is relatively close to the previous one, the outcome can still be quite different. For instance, take a look at the blue path on the slide here. It leads to a completely different local minimum compared to the original path we discussed earlier. Both of these two are local minimum, but they depend highly on the starting point. Alright, now we have developed an intuitive understanding. Let's move on the math behind the gradient descent. At the bottom of the slide, you will see the formal definition of gradient descent. It's essentially what we have already described, an iterative process to adjust the parameters and make them converge to the optimal values. However, let's take a closer look at how each parameter is updated during this process. In the formula on this slide, the column equals symbol here represents an assignment operation. This means we're updating the value theta of j based on its current value. The new value of the new value of theta of j is calculated by subtracting the product of learning rate alpha and the gradient descent. And the gradient or the deviation of the cost function. The updated value is then reassigned to the theta of j. Put simply, each step adjusting theta of j in the direction that reduces the cost function, bring us closer to the minimum. Next, let's talk about alpha, which is a learning rate. This is an important parameter that controls how big each step in the gradient descent process will be. We will dive deeper into learning rates shortly. The next part involves the derivative term, which represents the slope of the cost function at a given point. This slope determines the direction and the magnitude of the update for each parameter. Don't worry, we will also break this down further in a bit. Before diving into the details of learning rate and the derivative term, let's first look at an important aspect of the update process, the order in which we update each parameter. On the slide, you can see two approaches for updating the parameters. Take a moment and think, which method do you think is correct? Could both be valid, and why? I will just count down for 3, 2, 1. All right, let's discuss the answer. The correct approach is on the left, which uses simultaneous updates. Why is that? The reason is that each point on the cost function corresponds to a specific set of theta values. If we use a method on the right side, where each parameter is updated immediately after the calculation, the later updates will depend on the already updated values of the earlier parameters. For example, if we calculate and updated the theta 0 first, then the update for theta 1 will be based on the new theta 0 value instead of the original set of the theta values. This introduced a bias which disrupted the step-by-step process of finding the minimum. To avoid this, we use the simultaneous updates, where we calculate all the updated values first and only then apply them together. This ensures that every updated is based on the same set of theta values. Alright, since we have discussed the updated order, let's move on to the learning rate and the derivative term. To better understanding, we will start with a simplified case where the cost function depends on a single value theta. This is similar to the example we talked about in the last video. Imagine we only have theta 1 as the parameter affecting the cost function. With this setup, we will explore how gradient descent adjusting theta 1 to the minimum cost. First of all, let's take a look at the graph on the slide. Here we assume the relationship between theta and the cost function forms a U-shaped curve, which is a common scenario. The formula for gradient descent is still included for reference. When choosing an initial point, we start on either the left or the right side of the curve. Let's just go step by step and see how gradient descent moves towards the minimum, no matter where we begin. Let's assume our starting point as the yellow marked on the curve, which represent an initial value for theta of 1. At this point, the derivative represents the slope of the curve. To visualize it, we draw a yellow tangent line as a location. If you have studied it a little bit, you may already know or at least familiar with that the slope of this line or the derivative value is positive, which is greater than 0. Now let's recall our memory for the gradient descent updated rule. So here alpha, the learning rate, is positive. A positive learning rate multiplied by a positive slope will result in a positive value. Subtracting this from theta 1 will definitely decrease its value, right? So in simple terms, the parameter moves leftward along the curve. With the same concept, let's flip the scenario and start at a point on the left side of the curve, represented by the blue-green marker. So again, we still look at the derivative at this point, which is the slope of the curve. This time the slope is negative. Which means less than 0. Using the same update rule, since alpha is positive and the slope is negative, their product becomes negative. So subtracting a negative value is equivalent to adding a positive value. So theta 1 will be increased. This means that the parameter moves rightward along the curve. In both cases, whether we start on the left side or the right side of the curve, gradient descent ensures that theta 1 always moves forward to the lowest point of the curve. And finally, let's talk about the learning rate in more details. Choosing the right learning rate is a bit of an art. However, what I will say, you may not like it. That will be, it depends. We need to select a value that's just right, not too big and not too small. You might be thinking like, well, that sounds obvious, doesn't it? And yes, it kind of is. But the tricky part is figuring out what qualified as too big or too small is a specific situation. Even if there isn't a universal rule, it's important to understand what happens when the learning rate is too large or too small. Let's explore this in the next slide. Alright, let's talk about what happens when the learning rate is either too small or too big. Think of it like choosing the right pace for a hike. You don't want to crawl, but you also don't want to sprint off a cliff, right? If the learning rate is too small, imagine taking a baby step. Sure, you are heading in the right direction, but it's going to take forever to reach the goal. When the learning rate is too small, each step we take to adjust the parameter is tiny, so it takes a ton of steps or iterations to get the minimum point of the cost function. The process would work, but it's painful slow. If the learning rate is too big, now let's imagine we are leaping like crazy big dramatic jumps down the hill. Sounds exciting, right? But here is the problem. You might overshoot the lowest point entirely. Instead of gradually approaching the minimum, we end up bouncing back and forth, or worse, we could just keep flying further away from it. In this case, gradient descent cannot settle down and ends up failing the converge. Now that we have gone over all the parts of gradient descent, let's talk about when this process actually stops. Here is one general visualization to help us understand. Imagine theta 1 gradually moving down to the curve, and we have been discussing. Eventually, it will reach to a point where it is settled in a valley. At this point, the derivative of the slope becomes 0. What does that mean? If the slope is 0, there is no direction left to move. No more updates to theta 1, right? That's when gradient descent stops. In other words, the process ends when the parameter value converge, and we have reached to the minimum of the cost function. To wrap things up, let's tie everything together. Normally, if we choose a reasonable learning rate, gradient descent will always converge to a local minimum. And why do we keep saying local minimum instead of minimum? Look at the graph on the slide. The relationship between the cost function and theta isn't always a smooth like U-shape. Instead, it can be more complex and with more multiple ups and downs. In such cases, each value represents a local minimum. There might be one global minimum, but gradient descent, as we have learned it, can only find the closest local minimum based on where it starts. Once it reaches to the local minimum, the process stops because the derivative becomes 0, and there's no more downward direction to move. That's it for the basic concept of gradient descent. I hope these videos help you clarify how it works and why it's important in machine learning. Thanks for watching my videos, and please do give me a thumb up and subscribe my channel. Thank you so much, and I will see you in my next videos.